The heavy glass doors of the main city bank swung open and shut with a soft thud, letting in a blast of warm city air every time a new customer walked in. But inside, the air was cool and still, almost too cold for comfort. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly overhead, casting a bright, white light on everything. It was a Tuesday morning, but the bank was packed. People were everywhere, standing in lines that snaked back and forth between the velvet ropes. Most of them were busy. They were staring at their phones, checking their watches, or looking around impatiently as if their time was the most important thing in the world. Near the back of the longest line stood an elderly woman. Her name was Mrs. Higgins. She was small and slightly bent over, leaning heavily on a polished wooden cane that had seen better days. She was dressed neatly in a light blue cardigan and a long skirt, despite the warm weather outside. To her, going to the bank was a serious occasion. It wasn't something you did in your gym clothes. It was a place for respect. But looking around the room now, she felt like she had walked into a different world where nobody respected anything except speed. Her knees were aching. It was a dull, throbbing pain that started in her joints and shot down her shins. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying to find a comfortable position, but there was none. The hard marble floor offered no forgiveness. She had been standing there for nearly 20 minutes already, and the line had barely moved. Ahead of her, a tall man in a sharp gray suit was typing furiously on his phone, his back turned to her. Behind her, two young women were chatting loudly about a party they had gone to the night before, laughing about things Mrs. Higgins didn't understand. Mrs. Higgins tightened her grip on her worn leather purse. It was old, the leather cracked at the corners, but it was her favorite. Inside were the things she needed, her passbook, a stack of bills she needed to deposit, and her ID. She checked the zipper again, just to be sure. It was a nervous habit. She always worried that she would forget something, or that someone would steal from her. The world felt so fast and dangerous now, so different from the quiet neighborhood where she had lived most of her life. She looked toward the front of the line, where the tellers sat behind thick glass windows. There were 3 stations open. The employees looked tired. They moved their hands quickly, typing numbers, stamping papers, sliding trays back and forth. They barely looked at the customers standing in front of them. It was like a factory. One person in, money moved, person out. There were no smiles. No "how are you today," just business. "Excuse me," Mrs. Higgins said softly. She wanted to ask the man in front of her how much longer he thought the wait would be. Her voice was quiet, raspy with age. The man didn't even turn his head, he just kept typing on his phone, his earbuds in, ignoring her completely. Mrs. Higgins felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. She cleared her throat, a little louder this time. I was just wondering." The man sighed loudly, a dramatic sound that echoed in the quiet space around them. He turned his head slightly, giving her an annoyed look over his shoulder. "We are all waiting, ma'am," he said sharply. Then he turned back to his phone. Mrs. Higgins shrank back. She pulled her cardigan tighter around herself, even though she wasn't cold. She felt small. Invisible. It wasn't the first time she had felt this way. In the grocery store, people pushed past her. On the bus, nobody offered her a seat. But here, in this place that held her life savings, she thought things might be different. She thought people would have more patience. But she was wrong. The line inched forward. 1 step. 2 steps. Mrs. Higgins dragged her feet, the rubber tip of her cane making a soft squeak on the floor. Every step was an effort. She tried to focus on the little things to keep her mind off the pain. She looked at a potted plant in the corner. The leaves were dusty. She watched a digital clock on the wall change numbers. 10 minutes had passed since she arrived. Or was it 15? Time seemed to stretch when you were in pain. Behind her, the two young women were still laughing. And he said what one of them shrieked, her voice high and piercing. Mrs. Higgins winced. The noise hurt her ears. She remembered when banks used to be quiet places, places where you whispered. Now, it was just another loud, chaotic part of the city. Suddenly, the main door opened again, and a gust of wind blew in, ruffling the papers on a nearby desk. A young mother walked in with a screaming toddler in one arm and a heavy bag in the other. She looked exhausted. She looked at the long line and her face fell. Mrs. Higgins wanted to wave her over, wanted to offer her a spot in line, but she didn't dare. She didn't want to cause a scene. She just watched sympathetically as the mother went to the back of the line, trying to soothe the crying child. Finally, Mrs. Higgins was getting close. She was third in line now. She could see the face of the teller at the first window. It was a young man with very short hair and a tie that looked a little too loose. He was frowning at a computer screen, tapping his pen rhythmically against the counter. He looked bored. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere else but here. The person at the front of the line, an older man in a flat cap, was taking a long time. He was asking questions, pointing at his paperwork. The teller rolled his eyes visibly. Even from this distance, Mrs. Higgins could see the irritation on his face. He didn't try to hide it. He wasn't speaking, just shaking his head and making sharp hand gestures. The older man looked confused, his shoulders slumping. Eventually, the teller just shoved a paper under the glass and pointed to a signature line. The old man signed it quickly and hurried away, looking defeated. Mrs. Higgins felt a knot form in her stomach. Seeing that made her nervous. She had trouble reading small print these days. Her hands shook when she tried to write. What if they were rude to her? What if she took too long and everyone got angry? She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. I am a customer, she thought. I have a right to be here. But thinking it didn't stop the trembling in her hands. Next in line was the tall man in the gray suit. He marched up to the counter, slammed his card down, and barked an order. The teller didn't even look up, just typed and swiped. The transaction took less than 30 seconds. The man snatched his card back, turned on his heel, and walked past Mrs. Higgins without a glance, almost bumping into her shoulder. She had to steady herself with her cane to keep from falling. The man didn't even say sorry. He just kept walking, already on his phone again. Now it was her turn. The digital display above the counter flashed a red number, and a robotic voice called out, "Now serving number 42. Mrs. Higgins stepped forward. Her legs felt like lead weights. The distance between the velvet rope and the counter felt like a mile. She reached the thick glass and looked up at the young teller. He didn't look at her face. He looked at his watch, then back at his screen. He didn't say hello. He didn't smile. He just tapped his fingernails on the counter, waiting. Mrs. Higgins opened her purse. Her fingers were stiff and clumsy. She fumbled with the clasp. It stuck for a second, and she had to use both hands to pry it open. She could feel the eyes of the people behind her burning into her back. She could hear the heavy sigh of the person next in line. She hurried, her heart pounding in her chest, and pulled out her documents. Good, "Good morning," she said, her voice wavering slightly. The teller didn't respond. He just stared blankly, his eyes shifting down to her hands. "Next window," he said suddenly, his voice muffled but sharp through the glass speaker. Mrs. Higgins blinked, confused. I'm sorry. "System slow here," the boy said, not looking at her. "Go to window 3. Mrs. Higgins looked down the row of counters. Window 3 was empty. A young woman with glasses and a stern expression was just logging in. But the line had shifted. People were pushing forward. A young guy had already stepped up to the window she was at, assuming she was leaving. "But I was here," Mrs. Higgins said, feeling a flush of heat in her cheeks. The teller ignored her and started typing on the keyboard, effectively dismissing her. The people in line behind her started to grumble. "Come on, lady, move it," a voice said. Feeling tears stinging the corners of her eyes, Mrs. Higgins grabbed her purse and shuffled toward the empty window. It was only a few feet away, but it felt like a walk of shame. She felt clumsy, slow, and unwelcome. She reached the new window and stood there, waiting for the woman to acknowledge her. The woman was tapping at her screen, chewing gum with her mouth open. Finally, she looked up. Her expression was one of pure annoyance, as if seeing an old woman at her counter was the worst thing that could happen today. Mrs. Higgins took a shaky breath and laid her papers on the counter. "I need to deposit these," she whispered. She felt small, very small, in a world that seemed to have no room for her anymore. The day had only just begun, and she already felt defeated, just waiting for the next humiliation to strike. The teller behind the glass window didn't say a word. She just looked at Mrs. Higgins, then down at the stack of papers and crumpled bills that had been pushed through the small opening. The teller was a young woman with bright red lipstick and a name tag that was slightly crooked. She blew a large bubble with her gum, letting it pop loudly before sucking it back into her mouth. The sound echoed in the quiet space between them, making Mrs. Higgins jump slightly. Mrs. Higgins tried to smile, a polite, nervous smile. She adjusted her glasses, which were sliding down her nose, and pointed a trembling finger at her passbook. "I just need to put this in," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's my pension check. And I have some cash, too." The teller let out a long, heavy sigh that was loud enough for the people standing in line behind Mrs. Higgins to hear. She picked up the stack of bills with 2 fingers, as if they were dirty, and frowned. "Ma'am," she said, her voice sharp and lacking any warmth. "These need to be flat. You can't just shove crumpled money into the machine. Do you have any idea how long it takes to straighten these out?" Mrs. Higgins felt her face burn. I am sorry," she stammered. "I didn't realize. I ironed them, but they got wrinkled in my purse." The teller rolled her eyes so hard it looked like it hurt. She turned to the teller next to her, a young man who was busy tapping on his keyboard, and smirked. "Hey, look at this. She says she ironed the money." The male teller glanced over, chuckled, and shook his head before turning back to his screen. The laughter felt like a slap to Mrs. Higgins. She wrapped her arms around herself, clutching her cardigan closed. It had taken her a long time to get that money ready. She had carefully written out the deposit slip at her kitchen table, using her best handwriting. She had flattened the bills as best as she could with the heavy book. She had thought she was doing a good job. Now, she felt foolish. I can flatten them," Mrs. Higgins offered, reaching her hand out toward the glass to try and take the money back. "No, don't bother," the teller snapped, pulling the money away. "Just give me your account number again. And hurry up. There is a line, you know." "Mrs. Higgins fumbled for her passbook. Her fingers felt thick and clumsy, like sausages that wouldn't obey her brain. She tried to open the book to the right page, but her hands were shaking so badly that the book slipped from her grip. It hit the counter with a soft thud, then slid off and landed on the floor on her side of the glass. A groan went through the line behind her. "Oh, come on," a man's voice shouted. "Seriously?" Mrs. Higgins crouched down slowly, her knees popping in protest. She felt the blood rushing to her head. She couldn't see very well down there, the floor was a blur of gray and brown. She patted the ground blindly until her fingers brushed against the leather cover. She grabbed it and pushed herself back up, wheezing slightly. When she stood back up and looked at the teller, the young woman was checking her fingernails, looking completely bored. "Found it?" the teller asked sarcastically. "Great. Now, the deposit slip. You filled out the date wrong." "I did," Mrs. Higgins asked, squinting at her own handwriting. "That says today, the 15th. "No, it says the 14th, the teller said, tapping the glass with a long, fake nail. "Look, this isn't rocket science. It's basic math and reading. Can you not read the numbers?" Mrs. Higgins looked closer. The 4 was smudged a little, where her pen had run dry, but it was definitely a 5. "But I wrote a 5, she whispered. "Well, it looks like a 4, the teller said, her voice rising. "I can't accept this. You have to fill out a new slip. And you need to write clearly. Do you have another slip?" Mrs. Higgins nodded, tears now threatening to spill over her lashes. She opened her purse again. It was a mess inside: old tissues, peppermint wrappers, her reading glasses case. She dug around frantically, knocking a small bottle of pills onto the counter. The bottle rolled away and hit the glass with a clink. "Look at this," the teller said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. She wasn't talking to Mrs. Higgins anymore, she was talking to the line of customers. "She's dumping her whole purse out. This is ridiculous." People in the line were shifting their weight. Someone laughed. It was a cruel, short laugh. Mrs. Higgins felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She just wanted to go home. She wanted to be back in her quiet living room with her cat. Why was this so hard? Why were they being so mean? Finally, she found a fresh deposit slip. She tried to take the cap off her pen, but her hands were shaking so violently that she dropped it. It rolled across the counter and fell onto the floor again. "Oh my God," the teller groaned, throwing her head back. "Are you kidding me?" The male teller leaned over again. "Just move her to the side, Kelly. Let someone who knows what they're doing come up." Kelly, the teller, glared at Mrs. Higgins. "Yeah, step aside, ma'am. You're holding everyone up. We have actual business to conduct here. You can come back when you're ready to act like an adult and handle a simple transaction." Mrs. Higgins stood frozen. The words hung in the air. Act like an adult. She had been an adult for longer than this girl had been alive. She had raised children, buried a husband, worked jobs, paid taxes. She had lived through wars and hard times. And now, a girl with bubblegum and a bad attitude was treating her like a naughty child. I am trying," Mrs. Higgins said, her voice breaking. A single tear escaped and rolled down her cheek. The manager, a man in a suit that was too big for him, walked over to see what the commotion was. He didn't look at Mrs. Higgins with concern. He looked at her with annoyance. "Is there a problem here?" he asked the teller, not the customer. "Just an elderly customer who is very confused," the teller said, making air quotes around the word confused. "She's slowing down the line. Can't process the transaction. The paperwork is a mess." The manager nodded. He didn't ask Mrs. Higgins if she was okay. He didn't offer to help her fill out the form. He just checked his watch. "We need to keep the line moving," he said harshly. "Ma'am, please step to the side. You can fill out your forms over there on the bench. Don't block the customers." Mrs. Higgins looked at the line of people behind her. They were all staring at her. Some were looking at their phones, impatient. Some were smirking. A few looked sympathetic, but nobody said a word. Nobody stood up for her. She felt the heavy weight of their judgment pressing down on her shoulders. "I just wanted to deposit my money," Mrs. Higgins whispered, the fight draining out of her. "I just wanted to do my banking." "Not today, not like this," the manager said, gesturing for the next person to step forward. A young man with headphones pushed past Mrs. Higgins, bumping her shoulder hard enough to make her stumble back against the counter. He didn't even apologize. He just put his card in the machine. Mrs. Higgins was pushed aside. Literally and figuratively. She gathered her things slowly: the spilled pills, the dropped pen, the wrinkled money, the rejected deposit slip. She moved like she was underwater, slow and clumsy. She walked over to the small plastic bench against the wall, far away from the counters. She sat down heavily. The bench was hard. She put her head in her hands. The tears came faster now, hot and stinging. She felt so small, so useless. She felt like a burden. It was a terrible feeling, one that chilled her to the bone. She had always prided herself on being independent. She didn't want to be a burden to anyone. But today, in this bright, noisy bank, she felt like she had failed a test she didn't even know she was taking. From her spot on the bench, she could hear the teller still talking. Finally, the girl said to the next customer, "Some efficiency." Then they both laughed again. Mrs. Higgins wiped her eyes with a crumpled tissue from her pocket. She looked down at her stack of money and paperwork. Maybe she should just leave. Maybe she should put her money in a coffee jar and hide it under her bed. But she knew she couldn't do that. She had bills to pay. She needed to do this. But the thought of getting back in that line, of facing those eyes again, it was too much. She sat there, frozen in her humiliation, wishing the ground would just open up and swallow her whole. The noise of the bank seemed to get louder and louder, the beeps, the typing, the talking, all swirling around her until she felt dizzy. She just wanted to disappear. Mrs. Higgins sat on the hard plastic bench, her head lowered, staring at her hands as they lay tremulously in her lap. The noise of the bank seemed to swirl around her like a storm, but she felt strangely detached from it, as if she were underwater. She could hear the beep of the scanner, the shuffle of papers, and the low murmur of conversations, but none of it registered. She just wanted the ground to open up and swallow her whole. The humiliation of the last few minutes sat heavy in her chest, a tight knot that made it hard to breathe. She wiped her eyes with the crumpled tissue again, trying to make herself look presentable, but she knew her face was red and blotchy. She felt foolish for crying, foolish for coming here alone, and foolish for thinking she could still manage in this fast-paced world that had left her behind. Nearby, the line continued to move. The people who had witnessed her embarrassment had already gone back to their own lives, checking their phones or staring at the ceiling, indifferent to the old woman crying on the bench. The teller, the young woman with the red lipstick, was now serving a businessman in a sharp suit. She was smiling at him, her posture straight and attentive, a complete contrast to the way she had treated Mrs. Higgins. It was a painful sight to see, a reminder that kindness was often saved for those who looked like they had money or power. Just then, the heavy glass doors at the front of the bank slid open with a mechanical whoosh. A gust of wind blew in, carrying the smell of exhaust fumes and hot asphalt from the street outside. A man walked in. At first, nobody really noticed him. He wasn't wearing a suit, and he wasn't carrying a briefcase. He was dressed in a simple, dark jacket, a pair of faded blue jeans, and worn-out boots. He had a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, shielding his face, and he kept his head down as he stepped onto the marble floor. He looked like any other guy on the street, someone who might be on his way to grab a coffee or walk a dog. He moved quietly, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched as if he were trying to make himself smaller. He walked toward the center of the room and stopped, looking around slowly. He wasn't looking at the signs directing people to the queues or the list of interest rates on the wall. He seemed to be just listening. He took a slow breath, his eyes scanning the room beneath the brim of his hat. It was a teenager standing near the back of the line who noticed him first. The boy was wearing a band t-shirt and holding a skateboard. He did a double take, his eyes widening. He elbowed his friend aggressively, whispering something frantically while pointing at the man in the dark jacket. The friend looked up, confused at first, then his jaw dropped. The whisper started to spread. It moved through the line like electricity. Is that? No way. It is. It's totally him. People stopped checking their phones. The indifference in the room evaporated instantly, replaced by a buzzing energy of recognition. Heads turned. Cameras were raised subtly, trying to capture a picture without being obvious. It was Keanu Reeves. The actor, the movie star, the man known for being kind and humble. But he didn't act like a star. He didn't wave or acknowledge the attention. He just stood there, looking uncomfortable with the eyes suddenly fixed on him. He adjusted his cap, pulling it down even lower, as if he wished he could turn invisible. He didn't head for an open window. Instead, he seemed to be assessing the mood of the room. He watched the tellers for a moment. He saw the tired expressions, the mechanical movements. Then, his gaze drifted past the line of people who were trying to catch his eye. He looked toward the side, toward the plastic bench against the wall. He saw Mrs. Higgins. She was still sitting with her head down, her shoulders slumped forward, looking small and defeated amidst the grandeur of the bank. Next to her lay her scattered papers, her dropped pen, and her bag of spilled pills. She was an island of sadness in a sea of excitement. Keanu stared at her for a long moment. The excitement in the room faded into the background for him. He didn't see a fan or a photo opportunity. He saw a person in pain. He noticed the way her hands shook as she tried to put the pills back into the bottle. He noticed the tissues balled up in her fist. Something in his face changed. The slight guardedness disappeared, replaced by a look of genuine concern. He took a step toward her. The crowd watched, confused. Why was the movie star going to sit on a plastic bench next to an old lady? Why wasn't he going to the counter? The young teller with the red lipstick noticed him then. Her eyes went wide, and her mouth formed a perfect O of surprise. She smoothed her hair frantically and fixed her name tag, a bright, practiced smile snapping onto her face. She leaned forward over the counter, ignoring the customer in front of her. "Mr. Reeves?" she called out, her voice high and squeaky. "Welcome. Can I help you with something? We can open a special window for you. You don't have to wait." Keanu ignored her. He didn't even glance in her direction. He kept walking, his boots making a soft thud on the floor with every step. He walked right past the velvet ropes, past the people reaching out to touch his arm, past the manager who was rushing out of his office with a look of panic. He stopped right in front of Mrs. Higgins. She didn't look up at first. She was too busy trying to screw the lid back onto her pill bottle, but her hands were shaking too badly to grip it. "Excuse me," a voice said. It was a deep, quiet voice. A gentle voice. It wasn't loud or demanding. It was just calm. Mrs. Higgins jumped slightly. She looked up, blinking her eyes to clear the tears. When she focused, she saw a pair of dark, soulful eyes looking down at her from under a baseball cap. He had a bit of gray stubble on his chin and lines around his mouth that looked like he had smiled a lot in his life. He didn't look annoyed. He didn't look impatient. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Higgins stammered, instinctively scooting over on the bench to make room. "I didn't know anyone was standing there." The man smiled. It was a small, crooked smile, but it reached his eyes. "It's okay," he said. He crouched down so that he was on eye level with her, instead of standing over her. He didn't want to tower above her. "You look like you're having a rough day." Mrs. Higgins let out a shuddering breath. She looked around, realizing that the entire bank was staring at them. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice trembling. "I'm just clumsy. I made a mess." The man reached out. He didn't grab the pill bottle or try to take over. He just placed a hand gently on the edge of the bench, close to hers but not touching her, a silent offer of support. "I saw what happened," he said, his voice low so that only she could hear. "That teller, she wasn't very nice to you." Mrs. Higgins felt a fresh wave of tears, but this time, they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of relief. For the first time in an hour, someone was actually seeing her. I couldn't get the money flat," she whispered, as if confessing a crime. "And my hands." "Your hands look fine to me," the man said softly. He glanced at the teller station, where the young woman was now craning her neck to see what he was doing. "Her hands are the problem. Not yours." Mrs. Higgins blinked in surprise. Nobody had ever spoken to her like this. This stranger, this handsome, kind stranger, was defending her. "But, they told me to move," she said. "The manager said I was holding up the line." The man turned his head slightly, looking over his shoulder at the line of people. For a second, his expression hardened. It was a look that said he wasn't happy. Then he looked back at Mrs. Higgins, and his face softened again. "You can't hold up the world if the world doesn't have time for you," he said. He reached out and picked up the pill bottle that had rolled near his foot. He held it out to her. "Here." Mrs. Higgins took it. Her fingers brushed against his. His hand was warm and steady. "Thank you," she whispered. She looked at him more closely. He seemed familiar, but she couldn't place him. Do I know you? You look like a movie star." The man laughed softly. A genuine, warm laugh. "No, ma'am. Just a guy waiting for a turn like everyone else." He gestured to the scattered papers on her lap. "Do you need some help sorting those out? I'm pretty good at paper." The bank was silent now. The only sounds were the hum of the air conditioner and the distant traffic outside. The teller was frozen. The manager was standing halfway between his office and the bench, unsure of what to do. The people in the line had stopped taking pictures. They were just watching, fascinated by the scene playing out in front of them. A superstar was crouching on a dirty floor, offering to help an old woman with her paperwork, ignoring the VIP treatment waiting for him. Mrs. Higgins looked at the stack of bills, the deposit slip, and the passbook. She looked at the man's kind eyes. I would like that very much," she said, a small, fragile smile finally appearing on her face. Keanu Reeves nodded and sat down next to her on the hard bench, ready to help. Keanu sat down on the hard plastic bench, resting his elbows on his knees so he was level with Mrs. Higgins. He didn't rush. He didn't look at his watch. He didn't look at the crowd of people staring at them or the bank employees who were whispering frantically near the manager's office. He focused entirely on the mess of paperwork in the old woman's lap. "Okay," he said softly, picking up a crumpled $5 bill. "Let's start here. These just need a little bit of love, that's all." He took the bill between his hands and smoothed it out with his thumbs, moving slowly and carefully. The paper made a soft crinkling sound in the quiet bank. Mrs. Higgins watched him, her mouth slightly open. She couldn't believe it. This man, who looked like he belonged on a movie screen, was sitting on a dirty bench next to her, ironing out her money with his bare hands. You don't have to do that," she whispered. "I can do it. I'm just slow." Keanu looked up and smiled. It was a real smile, one that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. "We aren't in a race, Mrs. Higgins," he said. He had remembered her name from when the teller had shouted it earlier. "Besides, I'm pretty good at this. I used to work in a kitchen, folding napkins. It's the same thing, just with more value." A small chuckle escaped Mrs. Higgins's lips. It was the first time she had smiled all day. "Well, I certainly hope this is worth more than a napkin," she said. "Definitely," Keanu replied, winking at her. "This buys a nice cup of tea. That's worth a lot." He continued to work through the stack. He picked up the deposit slip that the teller had rejected. He looked at the shaky handwriting. "You wrote the date perfectly clear," he said, his voice low but firm. "I don't know what that teller was talking about. This is a 5. It's perfectly clear." He took a pen from his own pocket, a sleek black pen, and clicked it open. He wrote something in the margin of the slip, then slid it back to Mrs. Higgins. "There," he said. "Now it's perfect." While he worked, the atmosphere in the bank shifted completely. The earlier impatience was gone, replaced by a heavy silence. People were standing still, holding their breath. The young man with the skateboard had put his board down. The businessman had stopped tapping on his phone. Everyone was watching the scene on the bench. They were witnessing something rare. It wasn't just a celebrity helping a fan, it was a moment of pure, human kindness that was cutting through the cold, corporate atmosphere of the bank. The manager, a tall man with a sweat-stained shirt, finally worked up the courage to approach. He walked over slowly, holding his hands up in a nervous gesture. He was terrified. He knew who this man was, and he knew the damage a bad review from a superstar could do to his branch. "Excuse me. Mr. Reeves," the manager stammered, his voice cracking slightly. I am the manager here. I am so sorry about the wait. We can move you to a private office. We have refreshments. You don't need to sit on the bench. Keanu didn't stand up. He didn't even turn his head. He just kept smoothing out a $20 bill. I'm fine here, he said calmly. I'm helping my friend. Right, of course, the manager said, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. But, we can take care of her transaction for you. At the VIP desk. Right now. No waiting. Keanu stopped what he was doing. He finally turned to look at the manager. His gaze wasn't angry, but it was intense. It was the kind of look that makes you feel like you are being X-rayed. She was waiting here for a long time before I walked in, Keanu said, his voice quiet but carrying across the room. And nobody offered her a chair. Nobody offered to help her with the papers. You actually told her to get out of the line. The manager turned pale. It was a misunderstanding. She was holding up the cue. She is a human being, Keanu said. He stood up slowly, towering over the manager, though he still spoke gently. And she is the reason this bank exists. Without people like her trusting you with their money, you don't have a job. You shouldn't need a movie star to walk in to remind you of that. The manager swallowed hard, unable to speak. He looked down at his shoes. Keanu turned back to Mrs. Higgins. Are you ready, ma'am? Mrs. Higgins nodded, clutching her now organized papers to her chest. I think so, she said. She stood up, feeling a bit stronger now. Keanu didn't just walk away, he offered her his arm. She looped her hand through his elbow, leaning on him for support. Together, they walked toward the counter. The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea. No one was annoyed anymore. They were watching with respect. They approached the window where the young teller with the red lipstick was working. She looked absolutely terrified. Her hands were shaking as she sat in front of her computer. She had heard every word Keanu said to the manager. Keanu helped Mrs. Higgins up to the glass. Here we are, he said. All sorted out. He pushed the deposit slip and the stack of smoothed bills through the tray. The teller looked at the money, then up at Keanu, then at Mrs. Higgins. Her face was bright red. I apologize for the inconvenience, the teller said, her voice trembling slightly. The sarcasm was gone. The attitude was gone. She sounded like a scared little girl. I will process this right away. Thank you, Keanu said politely. He didn't scold her. He just let his presence do the talking. He stayed right there, standing next to Mrs. Higgins, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, making sure she was steady. Mrs. Higgins looked at the teller. For a second, she thought about being mean. She thought about saying something sharp. But then she felt Keanu's hand on her shoulder. It was warm and steady. She remembered what he said about kindness. So, she took a deep breath. That would be very nice, dear, she said simply. Thank you. The teller typed furiously, hitting the keys harder than necessary. The transaction took less than 2 minutes. She slid the receipt and the passbook back through the tray. Here you go. All done. Mrs. Higgins took the book. She looked at the receipt to make sure the numbers were right. They were. Thank you, she said again. Keanu squeezed her shoulder gently. You got everything you need? Yes, Mrs. Higgins said, looking up at him. Yes, I do. Thank you. For everything. You're welcome, Keanu said. He leaned down slightly. "You have a good day now, okay, don't let them rush you." Mrs. Higgins felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the bank's temperature. She straightened her back. She picked up her purse. She didn't feel small anymore. She felt like a queen. She turned to walk away. As she passed the line of people, something amazing happened. A young man stepped out of the line and held the door open for her. An elderly woman near the back gave her a thumbs up and a smile. The mood of the entire room had changed. Keanu hadn't just fixed her bank problem, he had fixed the atmosphere of the whole place just by being decent. Mrs. Higgins walked out into the sunlight, clutching her purse, feeling lighter than air. Inside, Keanu stayed for a moment longer. He looked at the manager, who was still standing there looking miserable. Keanu gave him a nod, a silent warning to do better, and then he turned and walked out the door, too, disappearing back into the city, leaving a bank full of people wondering how they could be a little more like him. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind Mrs. Higgins, cutting off the cool, conditioned air of the bank and replacing it with the warm, dusty breeze of the city street. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, blinking in the bright sunlight. It felt as though she had been inside that building for a lifetime, though it had likely only been an hour. The noise of the traffic horns honking, engines rumbling sounded loud and chaotic compared to the sharp, artificial silence of the bank, but to Mrs. Higgins, it was a welcome sound. It was the sound of the real world. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with air that smelled of hot pavement and exhaust fumes. It wasn't a sweet smell, but it was free. She looked down at her hands. They were still clutching her worn leather purse and the newly updated passbook. Her fingers didn't feel quite as trembling as they had before. The knot of anxiety that had been tightening her chest all morning had loosened, replaced by a strange, warm sensation that started in her stomach and spread out to her fingertips. It was the feeling of being seen. The feeling of being valued. She glanced back over her shoulder at the bank building. It was a tall, imposing structure of gray stone and glass, looking stern and important. Through the windows, she couldn't see the tellers or the lines of people anymore, she just saw the reflection of the sky. She wondered what was happening inside right now. She wondered if the young man with the dark hair was still there, or if he had already disappeared into the crowds like a ghost. He hadn't asked for anything. He hadn't asked for a thank you, or a photo, or an autograph. He had just stepped in, fixed what was broken, and left. It didn't seem real. Mrs. Higgins turned and started walking slowly down the street. Her knees still ached, a dull rhythm that matched her slow steps, but she didn't mind the pain as much now. She felt taller somehow. Earlier, she had felt small enough to be swept away by the wind, but now she felt like she had roots. A few blocks down, she saw a small coffee shop with a round table outside under a bright yellow umbrella. It was a nice spot, usually filled with young people typing on laptops, but today there was an empty chair. Mrs. Higgins remembered what the man had said. "This buys a nice cup of tea. That's worth a lot." She walked up to the counter. A young barista with a nose ring and a bright green apron looked at her. "Hi. What can I get for you today?" he asked, his voice full of energy. "I'll have a cup of tea, please," Mrs. Higgins said, her voice steadier than it had been in the bank. "And maybe a scone." "Coming right up," the barista said, turning to make the drink. Mrs. Higgins reached into her purse and pulled out one of the bills she had deposited earlier that day. It was one of the crumpled ones, but now it was crisp and flat. She smiled as she handed it over. She didn't feel clumsy counting out the change. She didn't feel like the people in line behind her were judging her. She paid, took her cup, and sat down at the little round table under the yellow umbrella. The tea was hot and soothing. She wrapped both hands around the ceramic cup to warm them. Across the street, life was rushing by. People were hurrying to work, cars were speeding toward destinations, everyone was in a rush. But for the first time in a long time, Mrs. Higgins didn't feel like she was in the way. She sat there, sipping her tea, watching the world, and she felt okay. She felt like she belonged. Meanwhile, back inside the bank, the atmosphere had shifted completely. It was no longer the noisy, impatient place it had been when Mrs. Higgins first walked in. A heavy, thoughtful silence hung over the room. The customers weren't looking at their phones anymore. They were looking at each other. They were looking at the employees. The young teller with the red lipstick was still sitting at her window. She wasn't chewing gum anymore. Her bubble gum was gone, likely thrown away in the trash can under her desk. She sat staring at her computer screen, but she wasn't seeing the numbers. Her eyes were glazed over, her mind replaying the last 20 minutes. She thought about how she had treated that old woman. At the time, it had seemed justified. The woman was slow, she was holding up the line, and she had messy papers. But now, seeing the contrast, seeing how Keanu Reeves had treated the same woman with such gentle respect, the teller felt a cold pit of shame in her stomach. She remembered the look in the movie star's eyes. It hadn't been angry. It hadn't been mean. It had just been disappointed. Like a parent looking at a child who had pulled a cat's tail. That was worse than being yelled at. The manager was standing near the closed sign of his office, looking out at the floor. He felt small. He watched the line of people. Usually, he would be barking orders now, telling people to fill out forms faster, telling the tellers to speed up the transactions. But the words were stuck in his throat. He looked at the empty spot on the plastic bench where the old lady had sat. He thought about how he had told her to move aside just to keep the line moving. An elderly man, using a walker, slowly approached the counter in front of the teller's station. It was a similar situation to Mrs. Higgins. He was slow. He was fumbling with his wallet. The teller took a breath. Her old instinct was to sigh, to tap her fingers, to ask him to hurry. But she stopped. She looked over at the empty bench, then at the manager who was watching her closely. She took a deep breath, forced a genuine smile onto her face, and leaned forward. "Take your time, sir," she said softly. "No rush. I'm right here." The elderly man looked up, surprised. He relaxed his shoulders. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling slightly with relief. "My hands, they aren't what they used to be." "They're doing just fine," the teller said gently. She waited patiently while he counted out the coins. The line behind the man didn't groan. Nobody complained. They watched the teller, and they waited quietly. A young man in the line even stepped forward and offered to help the old man pick up a coin he dropped. The manager saw this. He saw the small act of kindness ripple through the room. He realized that efficiency wasn't about speed. It was about care. He walked over to the drinking fountain and filled a small paper cup with water. He walked over to the elderly man and handed it to him. "Here you go, sir," he said. "On the house." The man smiled, his eyes crinkling. "Bless you," he said. It was a small moment. Just a cup of water and a kind word. But it changed everything. The cold, corporate feeling of the bank evaporated. It became a place where people were humans again, not just account numbers. Outside, the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the city. Mrs. Higgins finished her tea and stood up. She felt strong. She picked up her purse and started the walk home. She passed a bus stop where a young mother was struggling with a stroller and a bag of groceries. Mrs. Higgins didn't walk past this time. She stopped. "Would you like a hand?" Mrs. Higgins asked. The mother looked up, surprised. "Oh, would you mind? I'm just trying to get the stroller over the curb." Mrs. Higgins reached down and lifted the front of the stroller, helping the mother push it onto the sidewalk. "There you go," she said warmly. "Thank you so much," the mother said, smiling. "People are usually in too much of a hurry to help." "I know," Mrs. Higgins said. "But today, I learned that we shouldn't be too busy for kindness." She walked the rest of the way home with a lightness in her step. When she walked through her own front door, she was greeted by the familiar, comforting meow of her cat. She put her purse on the table and took out her passbook. She placed it in the drawer where she kept her important things. It wasn't just a bank book anymore. It was a symbol of a victory. Not a victory over the bank, but a victory over feeling invisible. That evening, the local news aired a short segment. A grainy cell phone video from inside the bank was shown. It didn't have sound, but the picture was clear. It showed a famous actor sitting on a plastic bench, smoothing out money for an elderly woman. The news anchor talked about a random act of kindness. They praised the actor for being humble. They showed a clip of him leaving the bank, head down, refusing to talk to cameras. But the video didn't show the most important part. It didn't show the way the teller learned to be patient. It didn't show the manager offering water to the next customer. And it didn't show Mrs. Higgins walking down the street with her head held high, helping a stranger with a stroller. Mrs. Higgins sat in her favorite armchair, watching the report on her small TV. She smiled as she saw the man on the screen. She knew the world thought he was a hero. And he was, but as she turned off the lamp and closed her eyes, listening to the quiet hum of her house, she realized something else. By being kind to her, he had given her a gift. He had reminded her that she mattered. And because she mattered, she could make others matter too. It was a simple lesson, really. It didn't take millions of dollars or a movie star's fame. It just took a moment to stop. To look someone in the eye. To see them. And that, Mrs. Higgins thought as she drifted off to sleep, was the most valuable thing of all.